Is Megan Asadian from the Rape Recovery Center. I'm the outreach coordinator here, and I will let our facilitator today do her own introduction, but we're super excited to have her. For those of you who are tuning in on Facebook, please feel free to submit a comment. I will be looking at the live stream and we'll be fielding the questions as we go. And then also for those of you who are tuning into the webinar on Zoom, feel free to use the Q&A function below. You should be able to submit your questions, and then I'll make sure that we get those questions answered. But without further ado, Liliana, whenever you're ready, feel free to go ahead.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Liliana. I am the Director of Programs here at the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and also currently serving as Interim Director. And so I'm really excited to join Rape Recovery and talk about something that is really important to me, and the work that UCASA does as well, which is serving incarcerated survivors. A little bit about me. I'm originally from California and have been working in the field for over 10 years. I started as a volunteer victim advocate in LA County, and then later became staff at the Rape Crisis Center I was working at the time, and led our response team and our SARTs, and also our volunteer program. So as many of you know, this work kind of pulls us in different directions. And so later, after leading those programs there at that organization, I then moved over to the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CalCASA, where I led a lot of the work around serving incarcerated survivors across the state, and supporting organizations who were interested in serving incarcerated survivors. And so it was an opportunity for folks to learn on why this is totally part of the movement of ending sexual violence, and how so many of incarcerated folks face a lot of violence within detention. And so that's a little bit about me. And yeah, there we go. And a little bit about UCASA. We are the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and our mission is to engage with individuals and organizations in local and statewide collaborations to strengthen the effectiveness of sexual violence education, prevention, and response in Utah. So we have programs across the state that serve to support SANE nurses in their efforts to provide that forensic exam for folks. And we have program coordinators who serve counties and rural communities where there has been when there was a need for additional victim advocacy in that area. We have a rape prevention program as well, and we have a training program that really focuses on providing training to new victim advocates, and also ensuring that we're continually learning how to better support and provide a trauma-informed response and advocacy to victims of sexual violence. But again, our vision is that our efforts will advance a society in which sexual violence is intolerated, and hopefully really eradicating gender-based violence here in the state of Utah. So today, as I was kind of thinking about how we talk about this, of why the need to serve incarcerated survivors, I kind of put it into 3 points of we want you to hopefully develop an understanding of the basics of detention in the United States and sexual abuse behind bars, and identify and address concerns and challenges in supporting incarcerated survivors, and also have a discussion on how serving incarcerated survivors really fits in the overall movement to end sexual violence. And throughout today, again, the training agenda will focus on detention in America, sexual abuse behind bars, making a movement for all, and provide some resources for you all as well. I'm a big advocate for self-care, so these are some topics that may trigger or may feel a little heavy for you all. So make sure that you're taking time to check out if you need to, get a drink of water, reflect on how this is impacting you, those feelings that may be coming up for you. But again, self-care is essential now and always. So let's start with kind of talking about PREA. There is a lot of acronyms that we'll go throughout this, but PREA essentially is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And this was passed in 2003 with a unanimous support from both parties in Congress. And it was this opportunity to really look at how we support and prevent and eliminate a rape within detention. Initially, when PREA was introduced, it was reducing rape within bars, and again, that was taken away because we really don't want to reduce; we want to eliminate sexual violence. And so, PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, is a set of standards that facilities need and should be abiding by in order to address any cases of sexual violence, prevention of sexual violence as well in there. And this really guides their efforts to ending sexual violence in detention. And so I want to start with talking a little bit about how do we humanize those folks that are in detention? How do we understand and look at them as a whole and the complexities of trauma, and how while in detention, people can be subject to violence from fellow inmates or even staff within detention. And so I wanted to start by introducing a video of this phenomenal person whose name is Joe. And he shares his story of what happened to him when he was in detention and how advocacy supported him through his healing journey. And so I want to start with that, and hopefully the audio will work and we'll be fine. So we'll start with this video of Joe.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate has to check in with. And all those people, they all referred to me by my number. That advocate asked me what my name was. Because I'm not a thing. Because I'm a person with a name. And the first thing I told her was, my name's Joe.
Joe was one of the first clients I had, and I was brand new, like sexual assault advocate. Most of my communication with incarcerated survivors was through letters, and I would read, these words, and the feelings that they were expressing weren't all that different than any other survivor that I had worked with. The self-blame, the shame, the fear, the trauma, all of that stuff just was very similar to everyone else that I had worked with. The big difference being that, their resources were so limited, and their ability to self-soothe and their ability to seek out appropriate support was almost nothing.
I went to a psychologist. And my plan is that no matter what, am I going back into that cell? Psych says, okay, go get your move. So I leave the psych, and here come the cops. And he comes up to me and he tells me, he says, all right, let's go. I said, where are we going? He said, back to your cell. Put me in waist chains and put me back in the cell. Nobody would let me out. I was on top of my bed. I was on the top of him. He grabbed my ankle and he pulled me off the bed and proceeded to rape me. And the second night he raped me, and the third, and the fourth. Getting in contact with Jessica saved my life.
Some of the things that I would hear in the letters was just a lot of feeling isolated. And, you know, with survivors who weren't incarcerated, you know, they could just pick up the phone and call. You know, we had a 24-hour crisis line. They could call whenever they, you know, felt like it. But with the incarcerated survivors, you know, their access to that communication was so limited. And so there was something really powerful and like tangible about getting a letter, you know, and you could see how hard they wrote or what their handwriting looked like, and then being able to write back. It was kind of this opportunity to be very thoughtful in a way that I couldn't have been on the phone. In an immediate crisis, I was able to really be very thoughtful in my responses.
Jessica was my advocate when I was assaulted. She was the person that it wasn't my fault. That was a turning point for me. As soon as she told me, I knew you'd been raped. I knew, without a doubt, and she could have never said another word to me. At that point, I knew that I hadn't done this. After the assault, I had been treated like a number. And she asked me my name and she touched my hand as a human being. And it really made a difference. My name is Joe.
So I know some of you will be joining us through Facebook, and some of you may be listening to it at a later time, but I want us to kind of think about how we felt hearing Joe's story, and kind of think about what Joe said were the most powerful services the advocate provided, and kind of think about the current services that you provide to victims who are not incarcerated. Were there similarities? Were there things that that you all as advocates already know how to do and are doing? Was there a lot of differences between what the advocate provided for Joe as an incarcerated survivor and what you're doing now for the community at large? So kind of think about it, and once we think about it and process what we just watched and heard the story of Joe, I think we'll come to realize that those similar feelings and those similar services that he received are the same that you're providing to community members who are not incarcerated, right? That are out in our community right now. And so those same powerful services that you provide today are what our incarcerated survivors need as well. They need that advocate to say, it wasn't your fault. They need that advocate to say, I believe you, and I'm here for you. And provide, again, that trauma-informed response to survivors of abuse and of violence. And so with that story, I want us, with that story of Joe, I want us to think about then kind of shift into what detention is in the US and what that and what other experiences might come up for folks who are in incarcerated settings. So when we look at what detention is, we think about prisons, jails, lockups, fire camps. Some states have fire camps where if you are deemed a good behaved prisoner, you have the opportunity to work at a fire camp and be trained as a firefighter to combat fires in the state. There's also community confinement facilities, juvenile facilities, and immigration facilities as well. And so those are, what is defined as a detention. So detention operates within a city. It could be in a county. It could be a state or federal prison. And under the state and federal, we find the Department of Homeland Security. And then we have these private corporations like Geo Group, MTC, or CoreCivic. And those private corporations sometimes hold, our immigrant communities, or sometimes they are contracted with state or federal prisons to hold folks in detention. And those are our private corporations. So countries with the most prisons as of 2013 is the United States. We actually are home to 5% of the world's population and almost 25% of the world's prisoners. So we, there's a lot of alarming numbers to know that the US is the highest, country that incarcerates folks when the population in other countries are much higher than the US. So that's kind of just a little of a overview of countries and their incarceration levels. And women incarcerated rate is also pretty high and is going up as of from incarceration rate from 1910 to 2014. And with that, we will go into women's incarceration in Utah. So in the United States, compared to Utah, we're pretty close to the national average of women in incarcerated settings. And then Utah numbers around incarceration based on ethnicity. Most of the folks that are in our detention facilities in the state of Utah in 2010 is pretty high between American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Black community and the Hispanic community coming in third. These are pretty typical throughout the state to see that communities of color are higher risk of being incarcerated and that are extremely vulnerable to incarceration. And so this kind of gives us an overview and kind of thinking about Utah as a whole. This should be a bit alarming for us to kind of see the high rates of communities of color that are being incarcerated in the state of Utah. Girls of color account for approximately 22% of the general youth population, but comprise approximately 66% of girls who are incarcerated. So again, we see that highly disproportionate amount of people of color are incarcerated. So let's talk a little bit about the structural violence when the rules, norms, or culture of an institution cause harm to people, including violations of human rights. And we need to talk about this because the structure is very evident in detention settings. And so when we talk about structural violence, I kind of broke it up into a couple of sections so that we kind of get an understanding of what that looks like in the structural violence, in our community instructions, and then in a detention facility as well, what that looks like. And so we know that around sexual violence, there is a code of silence, that people don't want to talk about sexual violence. It's still very taboo. And we see that within our community, that violence is ignored. So the violence against women, against people of color, against vulnerable communities is really just not treated, or we're not talking about it, or it's just ignored at times. And we see that a lot in how people respond to cases of sexual violence, whether it's an institution or whether it's a community. In the detention facility, the same kind of structure is there. Violence is ignored. It's kind of almost expected that, it's not kind of, it's expected that if you go to prison, that there will be high levels of violence happening. And so violence is ignored. And we as a, society kind of also, joke around, violence or sexual violence within detention. And so again, it just perpetuates this feeling of ignoring the violence happening, because maybe we think these people deserve it. They committed a crime, and so they deserve to be, assaulted, or whatever the situation might be that they're facing. So another form of structural violence is normalizing violence. So violence in the community may be dismissed. Again, in the detention facility, it's dismissed as well. So if somebody comes forward, like Joe, for instance, and says, this happened to me, he may be dismissed. He may not be believed. They may think that he's doing it because he wants to move cells, or he's not getting along with his cellmate, whatever that may be. And then again, this violence that occurred to him is dismissed and ignored. And then we think about prejudice, and violence is seen as deserved. So we think about, again, who are going into our detention facilities, and we're seeing that, well, if they committed a crime, then they deserve to be assaulted. Well, the same kind of feeling, again, like we talked about earlier, is seen in those detention facilities, that it is deserved, when, again, this is the structure that we've been taught to be in, and we're trying to dismantle that structure of violence, right? When we're talking about prevention work, or we're talking about advocacy work around ending gender-based violence. Then we think about retaliation. Survivors in the community may be punished. They may be, obviously we hear a lot around, well, she shouldn't have been wearing that, they shouldn't have been there, they should have done X, Y, and Z, right? And so then, because they didn't do this, this is what happened to them, when we should be saying no, right? That no matter what you were doing, you never deserve to be raped or assaulted. And again, the same situation happens in detention facilities, where survivors are punished. They may be put into isolation for their own protection because they reported a crime. They may be said that they're being defiant. And so that means that if they're being defiant, their time in the facility might extend, because this person who may be the perpetrator or harm doer is in a position of power and can control when the person, if they have a leave date from the facility already, can impact that. And so then again, survivors are punished for coming forward. And then there's this structure of isolation. Survivors may not feel comfortable coming forward. They may not get that help that they need, because again, the community that they're living in or they're in has created the structure of isolation for survivors. We see that a lot with students who are facing violence within their institution, or from someone in their institution. They don't feel like they can get help if they're not going to be believed, or a community or the institution has not set up a structure that really supports survivors getting help and being seen. And again, the same thing applies in detention, and is set up that way. If it's a sense of isolation, if you come forward to say, this has happened to me, you can potentially be putting your own life at risk when you're reporting someone else who may be either a fellow inmate or someone who is in a position of power, like staff, who has done this to you. So again, it creates this level of isolation where survivors cannot get help. And for folks that are in detention, the added layer of this is that they're stuck, right? They cannot leave. They cannot leave that environment. They have to stay within that structure of violence and continue to be in this state of victimization and not being able to get help and not seen, because the structure has not been set up to support and help survivors get that help that they need. Okay, and then what does sexual abuse look like? What is it, and how it, what rates is it happening? And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this this infographic about people who have been sexually abused in the community, and the same kind of vibe and connection happens with those that are in detention. So 200,000 people were sexually abused in detention in 2011. Only 8,763 reports were filed. 902 reports were substantiated, which is a huge discrepancy. When we say substantiated, it doesn't mean that people were held accountable. It just means that in the investigation, in a PREA investigation, 902 of those cases were found with substantial evidence that some type of assault occurred within that facility. So studies show that nearly equal rates of sexual abuse by staff and other inmates are happening within detention facilities. And so this doesn't necessarily need to be that it's the correctional officer who's doing the abuse. It could be staff who are the cooks in there, who are the doctors, who are working within the facility. So that is really alarming for us to kind of think about that 50% of the cases of sexual abuse happening in detention are coming from somebody in a position of power, from staff within the facility, and the other 50% are coming from fellow inmates. So it's a lot higher actually of staff in youth correctional facilities as well. I believe it's about almost, I want to say up to a 70% to 80% that the assaults are happening by staff within the facility in youth facilities. So abuse by staff can be abuse of authority. It could be through sexual harassment, voyeurism, abusive searches, sexual violence, and rape. In the time where I did work around serving incarcerated survivors, we saw a lot of reports around abusive searches, and so at any at times, many times throughout your stay there, you could be searched by staff, and those are the times where we saw a lot more reports on abusive searches and when folks were incarcerated, and a lot of sexual harassment happening as well during those times. Abuse by other inmates may be against sexual harassment, protective pairing, and relationship abuse. And you'll hear that word when doing this work, and I'll briefly kind of go over it, but protective pairing is when someone who's incarcerated needs to get support or protection from another inmate in order to not be assaulted, not be threatened or harassed. And so they look for that person who can protect them from other potential inmates who may want to cause harm to them. And so it's a way of surviving really their incarceration. And this many times within the facility can be seen as relationships, but recognizing the dynamics of it, these relationships are not often consensual. They're just trying to survive. And so they have no other option. If they can't find someone to protect them, then they're extremely vulnerable to other inmates coming and, again, assaulting them and potentially even rape. We also see a lot of sexual exploitation happening within incarcerated facilities or incarcerated settings. We see that a lot actually when I was working on this before we started to really see a dynamic between human trafficking happening within detention facilities. And we did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people who were in those who were being sexually exploited by another or fellow inmate, and sometimes staff as well. We see a lot of gang abuse, and of course we see sexual abuse and rape within detention by other inmates. And I'm sorry, I know that because we're live and that you may be seeing this now or seeing it later, opportunities for questions, but please, if there's any questions, I will have my email at the end of this so that you can reach out for support and help. So when we think about who's the most vulnerable and who's the most targeted for sexual abuse behind bars, I always kind of prompt this question to kind of get folks to think about what the assumption or who they think are the most vulnerable. And you hear a lot of responses like maybe someone who's small in stature, someone who is new to coming into detention facilities. And so you get a lot of different responses in that. LGBTQ folks are also very vulnerable and targeted. So in federal and state prisons, inmates with serious psychological distress are 9 times more likely to be sexually abused by another inmate than those with no indication of mental illness. So again, we see that those that are, extremely more vulnerable to violence within a community, the same thing applies within a detention facility. So I'd like to also, again, when I'm doing and talking about a topic like serving incarcerated survivors that many folks may not feel ready to do or feel some sort of bias against this, is introducing words and people and humanizing the experience of incarcerated survivors. So this is a survivor of sexual abuse in an Illinois prison, and in his own words, there's no therapy for rape victims in prison. The prison system is incompetent to handle the mentally ill and in face causes the mental illness that it should be treating. And so again, this is the voice of Scott and his lived experience. It doesn't mean that this is a blanket statement for all facilities, because again, every facility is different, but for many survivors, this is very true, that there are a lot of gaps in the services that are available for folks who have some type of disability, specifically a mental their mental capability, and again, the stressor of being in detention and having to deal with all those dynamics only adds to their vulnerability. Desi says, Desi, a transgender woman serving time at a men's prison who was in several sexually abusive protective pairings, says, the options for me are to choose up with a husband that's both strong enough and respected enough to protect me, and with the enough income to take care of me as his prison wife, or I can be conscripted into a gang as a prison gang and forced to have multiple sex partners who may or may not take care of me. So I try to choose the lesser of two evils. And so this is what I was talking about in the protective pairing piece of detention facilities. Desi had to find someone who was going to protect her and be his prison wife, like she says, in order to get protected from other folks within the facility who may want to abuse Desi. And so she has to choose, either I go to this person who's going to protect me, or I become, or have to have multiple sex partners that may not take care of her. And so again, when we're looking at this work, a lot of folks might see it as an option, that this is her decision, or that was their choice to go into this relationship. And now this person, just because there's a protective pairing, doesn't mean that Desi's still not at risk to be sold to another inmate in the facility or another staff member in the facility by her quote unquote husband in the facility. So there's always a risk when choosing to be in a protective pairing or not. And again, it's survivorship for folks in the facilities. In juvenile detention facilities, non-heterosexual youth are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused by other residents than straight youth. Again, another quote from another survivor. Troy says, "I didn't know my sexual orientation, but I knew that I was different. Soon after entering juvenile hall, one boy forced me to have oral sex with him in the shower area. He claimed that he would protect me from others, but he didn't." And so we, again, often see these cases happening, especially to our youth who are or identify as LGBTQ+. We see that there are higher rates of violence within juvenile detention facilities and in our adult facilities as well. I want to talk to you a little bit about Rodney. And the story of Rodney came out a while ago, but it was really highlighted during the #MeToo movement of what it meant for us to look at incarcerated settings and look at survivors who were in detention facilities. And so Rodney was an article that was highly shared through the MeToo movement on what the voices of survivors are and within incarcerated settings. So I want to share this short video of Rodney and hear his story of being incarcerated.
I was so angry with myself because I felt like I didn't fight back. I didn't do anything. You can't look in the mirror because you're ashamed of what happened. You're ashamed of what you feel you let happen. I disassociated. The physical pain was not even a comparison to what just had happened to me. There was also a thought of that it's over. It was every time I was thinking that, oh, it's over. This is just the last. Just get over with. My goal was to get out of the entire situation. Already in prison, it's a very emotionally trying thing. Very emotionally trying. You're away from your family. You're away from a lot of things. But this going through prison and being raped is even more isolating. So you can't talk to anyone in some of the places that I've been. The counselors, and they're not trained for this. They're not trained to understand this. They're trained for pretty much suicide prevention. In the state, I saw a counselor once that wanted to know what my plan was when I left. So the more focus is getting back out and getting yourself together. So who do you talk to? Initially, I wrote JDI 13-page letter, and it responded with a lot of information for me. The information let me know, look, there are places to help you in this world, and here are some of them. We are also one from just my first time writing JDI up until today has always been that therapy. Just having someone to listen to what I rant about and how I feel about what's going on, what's went on. It isn't your fault. You're not the only one that happens to, and we understand. Sometimes even still today, I blame myself for this. Sometimes. And so to hear someone constantly tell you, you need that reminder, because if you're dealing with it yourself, I'm a step from the ledge. No one deserves this. No one deserves for their body, their mind, their sexuality. No one deserves that to be ripped from them because they committed a crime.
So I want to just kind of, before we go on to the next session, kind of unpack that for us as advocates in this movement of ending sexual violence. Rodney says something that's really has always kind of stayed with me, which is no one, whatever the crime they committed, deserves to be raped or violated. And so when I hear and share these stories of survivors who were in incarcerated settings and experienced sexual violence, it kind of brings me back to why we're in this movement and why a movement for all survivors. What does that mean for us as an advocate? What does that mean for us as an organization? And how we show up for all survivors of violence, not just those that walk through our doors, not just those that we meet at the hospital, but all survivors, wherever they may be, whether they're in our communities, whether they're in our confinement facilities, our jails, our prisons, our detention facilities. How are we engaging in this anti-violence movement? By engaging with those institutions where violence is such embedded in there, and that there are survivors in there who are needing the support from our advocacy, from our organizations. And so how do we then reach out to them and do this work? So we first have to kind of understand that we may come with bias against incarcerated survivors. And so when we first started thinking about this work, we recognized that we had to do an internal check-in with ourselves and say, what are those fears? What are those barriers that keep us from serving such a vulnerable community, such a vulnerable group of people, right? So there was all of this discussion around that. And there's a lot of people who said the fear of incarcerated people and the setting that they're in can be really scary. It can be very, intimidating to walk into a facility and hear doors shutting behind you and being locked in as well in this area with who we seem to deem bad people, right? And so that can create a lot of fear of incarcerated people and of the setting. And so then we thought about, well, what feeds into that? What is feeding into this bias or fear of incarcerated people? And so we really thought about it and said, well, where are we getting these messages from? And these messages were coming from media representation, right? We see all of these shows that depict these horrific, chaotic situations within incarcerated settings that really create this fear of incarcerated people. And so the media plays a lot of that. And I don't want to discredit some of this fear that may come up for folks in being in that setting, because there can be, fights happening within the facility. But in my experience, when I walked into the facility and worked with survivors in these settings, they were so glad that we were there, that finally somebody came in and provided this such needed support for them that they were seeking and needing for so long. Also, we identified the rigidity around the definition of victim or survivor. So who we choose to treat as a victim and who we choose to treat as a survivor, right? This definition that we've kind of constructed in our own advocacy movement of who is deserving in a way of our services and who may not be. And so we had to deconstruct that and say, anybody who comes forward and says, I've been a victim of survivor is deserving of support and advocacy and should receive support and advocacy, no matter where they lay their head at night, no matter if they're in our community or in their detention facility. And again, this other bias and kind of barrier from moving forward and serving incarcerated survivor was seeing that incarcerated people are not seen as our problem. Like, they're in this confinement facility, that's their problem. They're not in our community. But in reality, when we unpacked that and talked about that, these facilities are in our community. I live really close to the facility in Draper. It's in my backyard. It's there. It's part of our community. So how are we engaging with those folks that live in that facility? And also, kind of what does that mean to say it's not our problem, when a lot of these folks will come back into our communities and become possibly our neighbors? What are we doing to help in helping them get the services they need to heal from the historical trauma of abuse that many of them have faced throughout their entire lives and continue to face while in detention? And then how do we help them in that process to coming back into our communities, so they know where to get that help and support for those experiences that they have gone through, so that they don't go back to to that setting that they've been in, that and reduce the risk of returning back to these facilities. So getting them that support that they need from the point that they're in these settings, and so on. Later coming into an organization like the Rape Recovery and getting additional help and continuing their healing journey once they've left that facility. So some of the things that I wanted to talk about and kind of tips to addressing some of those concerns and some reactions around or biases around serving incarcerated people is understanding the resources that you can offer. What is it that your organization says can really say I provide for folks who are in incarcerated settings? Identify and ask what you need. What is it? If I'm an organization and I'm an advocate that is serving an incarcerated survivor, what is it that you need in order to provide trauma-informed, survivor-centered advocacy or support for this victim? Know your resources and addressing those challenges directly. So if we're having issues going into a facility and providing that support, who do we need to talk to in order to get that clearance for us to go into the facility and provide that one-on-one support? If that's not an option, then what are some other ways that we can provide advocacy? You saw Rodney receiving letters. You saw Joe receiving letters as well. UCASA receives letters from facilities across the state, and we always respond and give resources available for them that are ways that they can go back to, right, and look at. And one of the good things about letter writing that I really like is that letter that you write back to them becomes a resource for them. So they can pick up the phone and call, but they can read that letter that you wrote them, reminding them how to center, how to take care of themselves, what is, that they're believed. They can keep reading that letter to help them kind of cope with that victimization, right, and that isolation that they're in within detention facilities. I always say, visit your detention facility. If you have a prison, if you have a jail, whatever facility is in your area, go and ask to do a tour of the facility. Get to know that facility so that you see what it looks like when it comes in, so you know the process of coming in, and then you can say, great, this is something that we can do. It's safe enough for us to go in and provide those one-on-one support in-house in the facility if it's allowed. Or, if they're not allowing us, so we might have to just stick to, phone support. What does that phone support look like when this, when the phones are, open to other people to hear? So you getting a visual of what that survivor is experiencing when they're calling you, when they're reaching out for support, helps you understand what they're navigating, and also the barriers to even coming forward to say, I have been sexually assaulted within detention. And doing that cross training, you training the facility and the facility training you on how to be safe within the facility to provide the support if you're choosing to move into the direction of providing in-person services. And again, if you're an organization, developing really strong policies and address protocols for safety of your advocates, for safety of the survivor that you're working with, confidentiality, all of that, addressing all of that, and really developing those strong policies and protocols to better support incarcerated survivors. So what can we do? And we talked a little bit about this just recently by letter writing and, you know, phone calls and things like that as advocates. But I like this picture of kind of thinking of the services we currently do. If this woman were being raped, would you help her? And when we have this discussion in person and we talk about, of course, everybody says, yes, I would definitely help her. I do this, and then we unpack what resources would you give her, what is available for her. But then we look at the next picture, and how about now? How about now? Would we help this person who had been raped, or what resources could we offer this person? And really looking internally into our organization, on ourselves as a victim advocate. What is the difference between this girl and this girl? It's a different color of her shirt. She lives in a different place maybe, but the services that we can provide are similar to someone to the first person, right? It's just that we have a different set of challenges now when the next person in the orange jumpsuit is in a detention facility who is not allowed to leave. And so we have to navigate that a little differently, but the resources and the services that we provide in terms of believing them and providing them with that, letter of support for them to heal through in-person services, to letter writing, to hotline support, whatever it might be, is still the same. Except that, again, they can't leave, so we have to kind of navigate it a little differently. But the needs are the same for both women, for both people that are searching for support. And so in this work, I've heard from so many advocates who have fallen in love with the work around serving incarcerated survivors. It has been for me a huge learning experience as an advocate on how to navigate and provide support for a person who cannot leave their home and who their harm doer perpetrator may have a key to their room, right? And so the unknown of when it can happen, or the fear of it happening at any time, and how that impacts them if they come forward is really scary. And so some of the voices of victim advocates really inspire me to continue to do this work, and hopefully will inspire you to think, I haven't thought about this work of supporting an incarcerated survivor, but I'm interested in doing it, or I want my organization to be a provider for incarcerated survivors as well, is to be open-minded and open-hearted. The people we find in there that I've worked with have been one of the kindest people that I've been working with, who really are eager and wanting to heal and find ways to do so. And many times you, the victim advocate, because they're not connected to the facility, is the only one who can really be that support for them, that is not going to withhold any information on how it's impacting them because of fear of it impacting their release date, or how they, where they live, where they sleep, if they get moved, because it can potentially be dangerous for them. So, again, continuing to be open-minded and open-hearted. This quote really resonates with me, and I carry it with me all the time, is that so long as some 200,000 people are sexually violated in detention centers annually, rape will never really retreat into the realm of the unthinkable, no matter how many perpetrators we turn into victims. And that really, stays with me, because we have this rigidity around who a victim is, and who's deserving of support from whatever victim advocacy group we're talking about. But really, we cannot say we are in the business of ending sexual violence and exclude certain people from the conversation. And so we have to really think about, when we say we're looking at eradicating sexual violence, that we really are encompassing all survivors of sexual assault. Again, no matter where they live, no matter where they lay their head at night, is that we are concerned and really looking to the prevention and the eradication of sexual violence throughout the state of Utah, throughout the Salt Lake County, wherever we may be at, but that we really look at what that means for us and how we put that into practice, and how that's part of who we are as an advocate or organization. And with that, again, there's some of you will be at different points listening to this this training, and you may have questions, and so feel free to email me if you have any specific questions about the training. If you would like for UCASA to provide additional support to your organization, UCASA is working on developing and reaching, and we'll reach out to organizations through our Facebook, through our listserv, for organizations who are interested in doing this work to serve incarcerated survivors. And we'll be doing a training that will focus on how to reach out to the facilities, how to develop an MOU, what, the liability of you going in there, how do you provide training for your victim advocates who are providing that support. All of that will be encompassed in this training. So if you're interested, if you're listening to it at any time, if you're interested, or as a victim advocate, you'd like to know more about how to really put this into practice, we would love to hear from you and provide additional training for victim advocates and organizations who are interested in working and serving incarcerated survivors. But again, if there's any questions, you can always email me. You can find us on Facebook and on Instagram and on our website, but definitely for a direct point of contact, you can reach me at my email and ask any questions you have around this, or if you'd like any additional training on this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liliana. And thank you all for tuning in. Feel free to email Liliana, or if you have any questions or just more curious on this topic, feel free to follow UCASA and the Rape Recovery Center. And thank you so much again, Liliana, for taking the time out for this really, really important topic. And yeah, great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.